programs that we're all focusing on right now to expand access. So getting right into some of our questions, Dr. Ali, I'd love your thoughts on some of the major broadband programs that are aimed at connecting rural America, such as the Legacy Universal Service Fund, the Connect America Fund program, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and now IIJA. However you want to answer that, whether we go one by one or if you have any kind of grand thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to start the conversation, because this is Broadband.money, and let's talk a little bit about money. For those of you who have read my book, for those of you who haven't, who are listening, I don't mince words when it comes to my disappointment of the Federal Communication Commission's funding programs over the last 10 years or so. One of my major concerns with the FCC that I write about in chapter 2 of my book is how it has tended to privilege the largest, what I call in the book, the largest and the loudest providers at the expense of other alternatives. So we've preferred to focus on the national incumbent carriers rather than focus on the local and regional privately owned ISPs, cooperatives, municipal providers, all of these other alternative providers who, in my opinion, are actually doing a lot of the on-the-ground, high-speed, affordable connectivity in the United States, specifically in rural communities. And then, I was hopeful for the RDOF program, but was disappointed in some of the winners, some of the exaggerated claims, and of course, like we all heard what happens when like traffic circles and parking lots and parks get funding over and above rural communities who are really the ones, rural, remote, and tribal communities who are really the ones who have needed it. That being said, I'm excited for the changes at the Federal Communications Commission. I'm excited that they've started to kind of scale back some of the money in RDOF, started to do a lot more due diligence and learning from the mistakes of the past. So I'm going to give the FCC credit here for learning from previous mistakes. I think when it comes to the Infrastructure Act and the $65 billion for broadband, $42.5 billion of which will go specifically to deployment. I mean, this is the largest public investment in telecommunications in the country's history. So, it's exciting, but my concern, and I hate to start off this Ask Me Anything being such a pessimist, is what happens if history repeats itself? What happens if the money just goes to the largest and loudest providers? And then are we going to need another $65 billion coming down the line? That being said, like I said at my opening statement, I mean, the NTIA has a lot of work to do to craft these the rules of the road for the BEAD program. But then also we should be watching individual states. We need to make sure that states are well equipped to be able to handle the amount of money that's going to flow down the pipe through the NTIA. I'm reading some unfortunate reports around certain states who are going to start or who are contemplating barring municipalities from being eligible for state money, which would then put them in jeopardy for NTIA money. So there's a lot of politicking going on right now, which means there's a lot of opportunities for great reporting and for scholars. But when it comes down to will rural communities, tribal communities, remote communities be getting the best bang for the federal buck, so to speak? We need to be paying a lot of attention to what states are going to do in the next year or two.
Well, touching on that, you definitely mentioned the history of things that have gone on in the past. I'd love to get your thoughts on how the history and experience of programs like USF, CAF, RDOF, how that all plays into the IIJA.
Well, I think what we're seeing with the IIJA is actually a departure from USF-based programming, right? And we all know there's one of the side components of the IIJA is that it actually ordered a review of USF because it's unsustainable, right? It is costing consumers so much money to be paying into this. So we really need to rethink USF. That being said, I, for one, think we cannot abandon USF programs because broadband in rural and remote communities is almost always going to be a market failure. There are just simply not enough people, and they live too far apart to have that return on investment that is necessary since we've designated, broadband a consumer good rather than, for instance, a public good, or a utility or a right, for instance. So we're always going to need to subsidize operating expenses for rural and remote providers and tribal providers as well. So there's always going to be a need for some form of a universal service fund. And I'm going to be watching closely how the FCC addresses this order from Congress to report on the future of the USF. And of course, now with NTIA and the IIJA, we're seeing a massive congressional appropriation, right? $65 billion, which is not at all tied to USF. And in fact, I think the fact that Congress appointed the NTIA, the steward of this public money, then to states, is maybe suggesting that Congress has lost faith in the FCC to handle public money. Again, I'm going to give the FCC credit. They're trying really hard to revise a lot of its, a lot of their previous mistakes. But I think that this, for Congress, this is an important moment where they're saying, you know what, maybe the FCC hasn't been the best steward of public money, and let's give the NTIA its chance. Now, I know the NTIA is hiring like gangbusters to make sure that these programs are going to be staffed properly. There's going to be vetting. There's going to be a lot of work with states. So this is an all hands on deck situation. But we're going to see with the IIJA, I mean, outside of mapping, which is so very crucial, the FCC is going to take a back seat when it comes to funding. Of course, it's still going to have RDOF under its auspices, but it's not going to have a hand in at least the $42.5 billion. It obviously has a hand in the affordable connectivity program. But when it comes to the $42 billion for deployment, that's going to be all NTIA and states.
Now, on this theme of history, which you speak so much about in your book, making a case for why things like rural electric cooperatives should be used to expand broadband in the US, is there any one nugget of history you feel could be most helpful for us going forward and looking at the challenges that may rise up as we deploy these programs, something that we maybe should be thinking about the most looking towards the future?
Yes, in a line, the future is local. And here's what I mean by that. In March 2021, President Biden said broadband is the next electricity, right? And we heard this phrase a lot, right? So like electricity, we did it with electricity. And if we look at history, what actually did we do to electrify rural communities? We went local, and by we, I mean the Rural Electrification Administration. They went local. They bypassed, quote unquote, big power, the largest utility companies, and instead championed the creation of local electric cooperatives. Not only that, but they actually started what was called the REA Circus. I love both this idea and this name. And they went on a bit of a roadshow in the 1930s to talk to people about electricity, what you could do with it, how you could use it, right? Because a lot of people needed educating, not unlike today when we're still talking about the need to develop digital literacy, digital skills, digital inclusion, digital equity. That's much more than just wires in the ground or in the air. So we went local. And if there's one piece of advice I have for NTIA, for anyone listening, for Congress, FCC, it's local broadband is the best broadband. And I think history has shown us that with the REA.
I'm going to feed in a question from Broadband Breakfast's editor, Drew Clark. In your view, are there substantial or nominal differences between electric cooperatives and telephone cooperatives and the role that they are likely to play in building out fiber to rural areas? Are these two types of co-ops more similar than different, or vice versa?
I think, but I actually think I would answer both yeses to both. They are similar and they're different. So where are they similar? I mean, they are similar in that they are incredibly devoted to their communities, and they are trusted in their communities, and they're accountable to their communities. And I think that cannot be overstated. Right, the fact that they are willing to often take much longer returns on investment because they see, for instance, the deployment of fiber as an investment in the community. We can point to some amazing examples of telephone cooperatives like the People's Rural Telephone Cooperative in Kentucky, Alliance Communications in South Dakota. We can talk about Como Electric in Missouri. We can talk about Central Virginia Electric Cooperative in my home state of Virginia that are doing some amazing community-focused broadband deployment work. I think where they're different, however, is that telephone cooperatives are in the business also of consumer service, right? I mean, we can call up our telephone company and they have a whole, infrastructure around dealing with consumers along the lines of telecommunications. Electric cooperatives are often having to learn this when it comes to, folks calling them up and saying, "Hey, my internet's out. What do I do about this?" So that kind of consumer focus is going to be different. I think the other thing is that electric cooperatives have had a really good thing going for the last 100 years, right? They kind of stayed in their lane, and so some of them are conservative, and some of them are risk averse. And there's a lot more due diligence that has to happen along the lines of an electric cooperative when they're debating going into broadband, retail broadband or not. I think we're seeing some amazing examples of electric cooperatives doing it. And of course, the one thing that the electric cooperative has is oftentimes that absolutely vital middle mile, which is connected their smart grids. So they have the infrastructure in place. And I think right now there's a need to talk to boards of electric cooperatives, to listen to their members. Are their members really pushing for broadband? That certainly happened in certain districts here in Virginia. So I think the risk adverseness is something that might separate them. But again, they are both doing phenomenal jobs. And at one point, I called them the unsung heroes of rural broadband because of their commitment to their community. So I cannot speak more highly of electric and telephone cooperatives.
Now, on that topic, what challenges would you say, since we're looking at rural electric cooperatives from more of the broadband side, what challenge would you say there is in working with people who are more used to working on the electric side of these co-ops in terms of maybe logistics?
Well, I think the big logistics thing is just like, how do you offer a retail product that's not electricity? That's and then how do you form these strategic partnerships? Do you partner with a middle mile provider? How do you do backhaul? Are you going to lease your lines? Are you going to lease out your middle mile and then partner with a last mile ISP? There's a lot of logistics. Whereas for telephone cooperatives, they are going to be the last mile ISP. Electric cooperatives have a lot more options, particularly in terms of how they're going to galvanize that middle mile. So we see a lot of different examples. In Virginia, we've seen electric cooperatives become the last mile ISP. And again, I'll point to Central Virginia Electric Cooperatives, Firefly, arguably, I think, the most successful electric cooperative broadband program in the country. Then we see others where that have just leased out their middle mile to a last mile provider. And we've seen that example here in Virginia as well. And so these are all of the different logistical components that have to be considered by an electric cooperative when they're debating going into retail broadband. And of course, they also have to talk to their members, their member owners, their communities. Is this something that is needed? Oftentimes they're hearing from their communities, kind of banging on the door saying, we need this connectivity. We see the county, right beside us that has amazing fiber to the home broadband. Why can't we get this when they have an electric cooperative and we have an electric cooperative? So I think the conversations are very different for electric cooperatives to get into this new area. The other thing they have to make sure of is that the state they are in allows them to deviate from just being an electricity company. Do they have the rights to be able to, for instance, use their easements to deploy fiber? And this is something that we're actually debating here in Virginia. There's an interesting lawsuit going on right now around whether or not an electric cooperative's easements on private property apply to fiber optic cables, or if they actually just apply to power cables. So there are legislative issues, there are regulatory issues because they're highly regulated industries, and then there are the consumer issues as well. So there's a lot of moving parts for electric cooperatives who are contemplating the move to retail broadband. But from the ones that I've studied, the ones that I've spoke with, the ones that I've worked with, I haven't yet seen an electric cooperative who has gone into broadband that has regretted going into broadband. And I think that's an important point as well.
Right. I was definitely very curious to hear, and you spoke about that, kind of the interpersonal goals and challenges that come with that. And it sounds like it relies so much on speaking to your members.
Absolutely. But again, that's where the trust is so important as well, because they speak to their members, they are trusted. Right. And that differs a lot from the larger national carriers who are, not in that kind of constant local conversation with their customers, right? And that's also the difference. Are you a customer or are you a member owner? And there's a different level of responsibility and a different level of commitment there as well to the community. And I think electric cooperatives know what they're doing.
So since you've been studying rural broadband since before it was cool to do so, how have the questions about the problems that rural broadband faces and the potential solutions to those problems changed over the years of you doing this?
Oh, that's a great question. I was just giving a talk yesterday at Duke University, and one of the things I reflected on, the title of my talk is "Why Does My Internet Still Suck?" And I say still suck because 3-4 years ago we were still asking the exact same questions about why does my internet suck, and that was the title of a great Patriot episode on Manage. And I kind of just reflecting on it. So the frustrating thing is I've been working in this space for about 6 years now, which is not nearly as long as some of the amazing digital advocates and digital champions that are in the broadband community space, who I adore so much. But in 6 years, I'm not entirely sure the questions have changed or the challenges have changed. We're still grappling with getting broadband to rural, remote, and tribal communities, just like we were in 2016, just like we were, quite frankly, in 2009 with the Recovery Act. We're still grappling with this. What I do think where the needle has shifted is we are finally done debating whether or not broadband is a luxury. I think, if there was any holdouts, the COVID-19 pandemic, eliminated this debate, right? We painfully and very clearly learned that broadband is not a luxury. It is a need, it is a necessity, it is a utility. It is crucial for every component of everyday life in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and so on. So we're done with that debate, which was still a debate we were having when I got into the space. Right now the debates are around what is broadband, right? What is the definition of broadband? Does everybody need fiber, or are there other solutions? What is good enough, which is something I write about a lot in my book, the politics of good enough. So that's where the debate is. But fundamentally, we are still grappling with the two major things. We still don't know who has broadband and who doesn't, who is unconnected and who is underconnected. We also still haven't figured out a foolproof way to get these people connected. And that's, hopefully with the Infrastructure Act money, one of those questions, if not both of those questions, are going to go away.
So we have a question that just came in from Mike Culp.
Hey, Mike.
Very excited to see you on Broadband.money. So he wants to know, moving a little bit into the needs for labor resources. How do you see rural road refurbishment and electrical grid modernization dovetailing into fiber builds as the transportation and electrical crews work their jobs, new skills development for new jobs, micro trenching, and working safely in overhead telecom space, and massive makes ready for old electrical poles, even if fiber is a year more out, or dedicated crews? Is that what you should use, or some combination?
That, holy smokes, Mike, that is a great question. And you always ask such absolutely fabulous questions. This is something that is actually frustrating me. We need to have a much more holistic conversation at the intersection of transportation and broadband, right? Dig once policies are still few and far between. And one of my concerns when it comes to the Infrastructure Act is, that we've got this pot of money for broadband, and we've got this other pot of money for roads and bridges, right? But they're not talking to each other. We need to make it mandatory that when we repair a road, when we repair a bridge, when we build a bridge, when we build a new highway, that there are conduits in place ready for fiber, or we put dark fiber in there. And we're not having this conversation. So one of my concerns is, part of the Infrastructure Act money is going to go to, refurbishing a highway, and that's going to get done. And then maybe a year or two later, we're going to realize we never dug a fiber optic conduit and have to rip up that highway again, or maybe even micro trench. So there's an incredible opportunity for workforce development here if we start thinking holistically about infrastructure. Whenever we build, we should be thinking about deploying fiber from day one. But that also involves a massive regulatory change. But I do think there's a great opportunity to at the intersection of workforce development between telecom and construction, telecom and road maintenance, telecom and bridges, but we need to get everybody to the table, and not just broadband advocates anymore. We need to make sure that we've got transportation. So for anyone out there who would ever put me in touch with the Department of Transportation, I'd love to speak with somebody there, because I think this is the next generation of connectivity. And maybe, TJ, back to your previous question, maybe this is exactly how we connect rural communities in an easy way, which is to make sure that when they're getting Infrastructure Act money, there are fiber optic conduits in place. And then we can also provide the training for workforce development to make that happen. So there's definitely an incredible amount of potential, just like you said, Mike, at this intersection. We just have to grab it. We just have to harness it and bring people to the table. And I would be so very interested and so very committed to that conversation.
So now, speaking about in general, how you feel about the money that's being devoted in the IIJA to solving America's broadband divide. I mean, if I had to take a guess, I'd say you might feel positive or jazzed about it, but also potentially somewhat cynical or resigned. So what is your overall take and feeling about it?
Wow, you read my mind. I am not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I think that's the expression. $65 billion is tremendous. $14 billion for an affordable connectivity program is outstanding. I am so excited to see that amount of money. $2.75 billion for digital equity and inclusion. That is awesome. $42 billion for broadband deployment, infrastructure deployment. I wish that was higher. I, for one, was a big champion of the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act, introduced by Congressional Whip Jim Clyburn, who advocated for $100 billion for broadband, $80 billion of which would go to deployment. And why do we focus on that $80 billion number? Well, that is the number that the FCC estimated in 2017 to bring fiber to the home for every American household, $80 billion. So the $42.5 billion obviously falls short of that. It's also not the only pot of money available. There's CARES Act money, there's ARPA money. So again, I'm not going to look this gift horse in the mouth. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity, since it's flowing through states, to be able to really make sure that this money is getting to the communities that really need it. So again, my biggest concern when it comes to particularly that pot of money, the BEAD program money, is to make sure that rural, local, and regional, and cooperatives and municipalities are not being left out in the cold. And so I, for one, am going to be focusing a lot for my research on the 5-year broadband plans that every state is going to have to produce to be able to access this money, particularly over and above the $100 million that every state is guaranteed, to really make sure that states are privileging the and underconnected communities in their jurisdictions.
All right, we have another listener question in. Everyone keep submitting your questions. You absolutely have opportunity to be submitting those at this time and throughout the remainder of the session, and to potentially get them answered in our discussion. So from David That, it's pretty well known that, in his opinion, a family of 4 does not need more than 50 megabit down, 20 megabit up for work from home, so long as there is good queue management, no buffer float, and low latency. How does mandating low latency factor into your thinking about broadband?
Okay, 2 points here. One is I absolutely think that we need a much more holistic understanding of what broadband is. I think we are overly reliant on the raw speed, right? Right now it's 25.3, which is woefully inadequate, certainly for a family of 4. I'm not convinced that to be honest, that 50/20 is the right number. When I testified before the Senate, I said 100/100 was the right number. This is in line, of course, with what USDA has recently said in October with its Reconnect program for symmetrical speeds. And the reason I say that is not because what a family of 4 needs today or yesterday, but it's what a family of 4 is going to need 5 years down the line. We can't keep looking to what we needed a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago as the indicator of what we need today and tomorrow. We need to be thinking more future-proof for these definitions, and then therefore holding ISPs accountable to that. That being said, okay, so that's one conversation around speed. But I absolutely agree with you, David, that we need to be including things like latency, things like jitter, into the definition of broadband. Also, price, like, and cost, right? Is $200 a month? Does that mean you actually have broadband? Well, no, that's ridiculous, and that's an exaggeration on my end, right? But all of these issues factor in speed, latency, jitter, cost, into whether or not a family has meaningful access to broadband, or whether or not they are just unconnected. So I would absolutely love a much more robust, much more holistic conversation around broadband, and those are certainly happening in various places. But then of course there is this question of speed, and that's the current, I think, political fight is how do we actually define broadband. So I was excited that at least the Infrastructure Act, that on day one providers had to offer 120. I think that's a great way to start. Certainly better than 25.3, which I loathe, and which I criticize in my book quite heavily. But I would love for us to really start thinking through what do we need 10, 15 years down the line, and then making sure that ISPs are beholden to that rather than beholden to what we needed 5 years ago.
Now, a question we have in here, I think we've definitely established through discussion how important broadband adoption is to improving the lives of those who live in rural America. But to your knowledge, what quantitative studies have been done on the actual impacts of broadband for Americans living in rural areas?
Holy smokes. Okay, that's a great literature review question. I'm going to try to name a couple of quantitative studies off the top of my head, but whoever asked that question, please email me. You can email me at cali@virginia.edu, and I can provide you with a much more comprehensive list of studies. Okay, so Dare and Whitaker talked about the value increase to homes when you've got high-speed internet. The Fiber to the Home Council also said that it was 3.1%, I'm pretty sure. If you have fiber to the home, it increases your home value. Earlier studies by Aaron Strover talked about a rise in rural community GDP when broadband is available. There's a really great study, again by Whitaker, on civic engagement and broadband connectivity. Goodness, there's a phenomenal piece by Bowerly on telehealth, how telehealth improves or healthcare improves with broadband. There's another study by Lynn on public safety and broadband. These are, again, all quantitative studies, although I will say that qualitative research, was the type of research that I do, is equally as valid as evidence as quantitative data. But whoever asked that question, thank you very much for it. And this wasn't a great answer, but please do email me and I'll be happy to send you a list of citations.
So in looking at supporting local broadband, is there such thing as too much of a focus solely on local broadband, in your opinion? I don't think there's enough focus on local broadband, in my opinion. But is there too much? No, I don't think there is. And I'll just give an example. In the early contemplations of the Infrastructure Act, there was language floated around that local providers should be prioritized in the funding apparatus. And we saw this language applied at USDA and at Treasury for the capital build-out projects as well. When IIJA was eventually passed, it just said that local cannot be discriminated against. So a rather massive shift, in my opinion, in kind of the discourse around local broadband. We could also, I guess the other option is we can talk about, for instance, is it possible to have a nationalized fiber optic network in which private ISPs could then sit on top of it? I know there are advocates for this public option out there. I'm worried that we're a little too far down the for-profit rabbit hole to be able to really think about a national fiber optic network. But it doesn't mean that different entities can't participate. So I'm not sure that's a great answer, but
I would love to see, to be honest, more conversations around local provision and local ownership, because I don't think we're talking about it enough.
Question in from Doug Adams. How do we get people to move past this obsession on quantifying speeds as good enough? For a country that prides itself on innovation, we are limiting ourselves by not being aspirational. We can't say that 50 or 100 is good enough because we truly do not know what innovations are coming, or be dependent on robust bandwidth.
Oh, that's a great question. And like I said in my book, I write a lot about what is good enough, and that we've kind of been obsessed with just getting good enough broadband out there and then checking a box, right? And this is where, I love Susan Crawford's book, Fiber. And she talks about that we can't even contemplate the connectivity of tomorrow because we're so limited by this obsession over speed today. How do we get around it? I don't know. The Congressional Research Service defines broadband by user experience rather than by the number that the FCC does, which of course is 25.3. Is there a way that we can factor in more user experience into the conversation around the very definition of broadband? Is this going to take, a rewriting of the Telecom Act, for instance? Do we? But you're absolutely right that we're always going to need more speed. That's the last 20 years of internet connectivity has demonstrated that we're always going to need. I think the average download speed right now, according to Ookla, is 192 megabits per second, and around 68 megabits per second upload. And that's going to go up, right? We are relying more and more on our smart devices, and the more smart devices we have, this quote unquote Internet of Things, the more speed we're going to need. And then there's things we don't even realize that are going to be in the future for the potential of connectivity. And actually, I think it was Light Reading a few years ago wrote this great piece on how much speed you would need to have a Star Trek style holodeck. And I think it was something along the lines of like, was it 60 or 600 gigabits per second? I can't remember which one, but the fact that we're even contemplating, that Star Trek type devices suggests that like we're really limited on our imaginations around connectivity because we're so focused on speed. Yeah, which is not a great answer, only to say that I agree that we are overly obsessed with good enough speeds rather than thinking about what we need in the future.
All right, so speaking a little bit about the road trip that you took with your dog that inspired your book in part, and you speak about there. For people who haven't read your book, what was that like? So were people basically just complaining to you who you spoke to on the street? Was it mostly complaints you were getting about they had poor internet service? I mean, that would be, I think what a lot of people would think is what you would hear.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background on this, the rural broadband road trip, which was a hashtag rural broadband road trip, took place in the summer of 2018. And I had been researching my book for about 2 years, but only from the policy perspective and, doing expert interviews, going to industry events, going to the FCC. And I started to realize as I'm wading through, thousands and thousands of pages of dockets and public interventions that maybe my reader doesn't find policy intervention as captivating as I do, or as spellbinding as I do. But I also realized that maybe elected officials, when we talk about broadband in Congress, we talk about it in terms of companies, we talk about it in terms of speed, but we don't talk about it in terms of people. So I realized for my own research and for my own public outreach, I needed to humanize broadband. I need to put a personal face on the digital divide, both for myself and for my readers. And that's what kind of begat the rural broadband road trip. I heard, I think, less complaining and more aspiration from folks that I spoke with. It wasn't about, well, my internet sucks. It was more about, if I had good internet, this is what I could do. I could, and a lot of times it was, I could connect with my family. I heard this time and time again. I heard this in Kentucky. I heard this in Missouri. I heard this in Iowa. I heard this in Minnesota. I can connect with my family. And that was a very powerful message for me. The other thing I heard was the opportunities from that emerged from connected communities, communities that took it upon themselves to connect themselves and to find those public-private partnerships. Of course, I did hear griping about cost and about speeds, but I heard more aspiration, to be perfectly honest, than complaining, and that to me demonstrated also the absolute crucial need for a high speed, high quality, affordable connectivity. Is that people are, the folks that I talk to, is they're excited for this level of connectivity. They want this level of connectivity. They don't want just good enough broadband, right? They want the broadband that so many of us take for granted, and that needs to be our mission, is to connect to these folks because they want it.
Now, going back to where we were speaking more about history, which is such a core theme in this discussion and in your book, about co-ops. Those were created by law in 1935. How exactly have you seen that they've been such anchors in rural communities over all that time since 1935?
Well, I mean, just that's a great question. Just their longevity, right? I mean, like you said, they've been around since 1935. Telephone cooperatives, a lot of them have been around before then. Interesting enough, when it comes to telephone cooperatives, there was a massive surge in telephone cooperatives in the early 1900s, and then they dropped off dramatically during the Great Depression. And then it took the 1949 Rural Telephone Act, which gave rural telephone, incentivized the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, to kind of reproduce its electrification program with telephone, and that was tremendously successful as well. So their longevity in their communities, I think, is a major anchoring point for rural and remote communities. I think the other thing is that they are in fact local. So what we did in 1935, when the Rural Electrification Administration was created as an emergency administration, and then it was made permanent by the Rural Electrification Act in 1936, is that it didn't just give the money to the incumbent utility providers and say, okay, now you can go into the hinterlands, right? They went to local communities. They funded the creation of local electric cooperatives. They had a massive endowment at the time. And it was $100 million in 1935, 1936 to create these local electric cooperatives. And then they did the necessary education and skill training. So the entire apparatus of rural electrification through the REA, and I should also add through the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, was all about being local. And I think that history, that story, is absolutely crucial to the ongoing success of rural electric cooperatives. I mean, there are 900 rural electric cooperatives in the United States. They provide the bulk of power to rural communities. I mean, this is amazing. This is an amazing story. And there's been some great books written on it. I wrote, one chapter of my book on it. And I often go back to the successes of the REA to think through what we could do better today.
Broadband Breakfast reporter Ben Kahn is very curious. Do you have any conversations or experiences from your road trip that didn't quite make it into your book, but were really interesting nonetheless?
Yeah, actually, a couple. One of them was I was in Missouri at a grocery store, and at this particular grocery store, you could buy a beer and walk around the grocery store and do your groceries. And I was renting a little house as part of the road trip. We being my dog Tuna and I, rented Airbnbs all the time. So I was drinking this beer, walking around, and I met this young couple, and I don't know, I can't even remember. Oh, we were waiting in line for the beer. That's what it was. And I was talking about how enthusiastic I was about the opportunity to drink a beer while doing my groceries. And they were asking what I was doing in Missouri, and I was talking about my my work, and they were like, oh my goodness, this is one of our very good friends just bought a farm and paid to bring a fiber optic cable to their farm. So they were already aware of the massive cost involved in fiber to the farm. They had this great story. So that was one really great story that just didn't make it into the book, but was nonetheless powerful for me because it just demonstrated that, folks want to talk about this and folks want to share their stories, even if they're stories of friends. And also the amazing thing about drinking a beer in a grocery store. The other great story that made its way very loosely into the acknowledgments of my book is that I was in Mason City, Iowa, or just outside of Mason City, Iowa, and I had rented this farmhouse for the weekend. And I wasn't planning on doing any research that weekend. I needed a break from the road trip. I'd been on the road for about 2 weeks. And I was tired and I wanted to get some writing done. So I rented this farmhouse with Tuna, my hound dog, on a soybean farm. And it turns out that the next farmhouse over was also being rented out, and this family was having a family reunion. And they invited Tuna and I over for dinner every single night with their extended family. And the conversation inevitably went to broadband. It went to internet, went to the research I was doing, and all of I was sitting at this table of women, all of them cousins, all of them mothers, and that's just where I heard the need to connect with grandchildren, right? And the over reliance, for instance, on mobile networks rather than fixed connections, and the frustration around data caps and cost of mobile connectivity. And these women just talked about how they wanted to connect with their sons and daughters and grandchildren in a way that wasn't, overly reliant on their phones. A great story, great food, thanks to this family in Iowa. But that's, again, a story that didn't make it into the book, but really, really shaped, again, the urgency and importance of solving the rural-urban digital divide.
So you've spoken about recently in an article that was submitted to Broadband Breakfast that USDA made some changes to the Reconnect program, the criteria involved in that program, that there were some aspirations that you widely approved of to make internet access be expanded and make that more possible. And then the Consolidated Appropriations Act of the past year recently rolled that back. So why do you think it is that went so unnoticed, that all of a sudden those aspirations were almost wiped out by that act? And that seemed to kind of sneakily happen. How do you think you all maybe missed that?
Yeah, certainly the October 2021 Reconnect announcement, the notice of funding availability, did not go unnoticed. A lot of people talked about it. There were a lot of complaints. Again, one of the things it was doing was setting a rather aggressive speed threshold of 100, which is symmetric. It will by definition eliminate certain technologies. It also redefined broadband, right? It instead of the FCC's definition at 25.3, unconnected was then defined at 120, right? So suddenly we were going to see this massive explosion of eligible communities. It also prioritized local governments, nonprofits, cooperatives, and public-private partnerships, and that is particularly what drew some ire, particularly around privately owned local ISPs who felt that they were being discriminated against. Obviously, cooperatives were happy with it if they were going to be prioritized, but the privately owned local ISPs were a little bit put off by that. So we saw that. Then in March, just last month, March 15th, Congress passed the 2022 Consolidated Appropriations Act. And I was inspired to write this article for Broadband Breakfast because Kevin Taglang, who we all know and love of the Benton Institute, wrote about this first, actually, and talked about how Congress kind of snapped back a lot of these really progressive changes that the RUS was proposing to make. So, for instance, it reinstated the 25.3 definition, and it reduced the day one requirement from 100 to 120. I think what that does certainly is it keeps coaxial cable in the running for funding. Coaxial cable is almost by definition cannot be symmetric, and so the asymmetric definition keeps them in the running. It still eliminates technologies like DSL, for instance, from funding. The other thing, and this is particularly interesting for me, is that Congress in the explanatory statement chastised the Reconnect program for failing to be quote unquote technologically neutral. And I wrote a lot about technological neutrality in my book because I see it as a bit of a sham. And I looked to the words of the NRECA, who wrote that you can be technologically neutral, but you mustn't be technologically blind. And I think we are being technologically blind when we continue to have such low thresholds that we have these outdated technologies of connectivity that continue to float around. So I was disappointed not only that Congress reversed many of Reconnect's progressive platforms, but they also got spanked. There's nothing in the October 2021 Reconnect notice of funding availability that prioritizes one technology over another. It was technologically neutral. It just set a higher speed threshold. By snapping it back, we're being technologically neutral, but we're also being technologically blind. And that's in my opinion, one of the major policy failures of broadband today.
Now, with that, I mean, money keeps being thrown at the Reconnect program. Do you think that's as a distraction, maybe, to the fact that everything in terms of policy was being snapped back?
I hope not. I hope it wasn't a smokescreen to see the snapback. I mean, Reconnect has been tremendously successful, and it got another $2 billion in the Infrastructure Act and $100 million in CARES Act or ARPA, and now the Consolidated Appropriations Act gave another $436 million. I'm hoping we're continuing to fund Reconnect because it's been very successful. Not because, if we throw a lot of money out there, it means that we can do whatever we want. Interestingly enough, the original Reconnect, which was passed in the 2018 Consolidated Appropriations Act, also had a very weird definition that you could only be an eligible area if 90% of the area was unconnected. It's very difficult to find areas in the United States where 90% is unconnected or underconnected. So this is a weird flex, I think, by Congress, to use the language of young people, when it comes to Reconnect. Congress has more so than US, more than FC, more so than NTIA. Congress has felt that it has the authority to draw very strict parameters around the Reconnect program. And when USDA tries to flex its own muscles, it's getting snapped back. So maybe what we're seeing is some weird fight between Congress and USDA as well. Maybe that's going to be my next article for Broadband Breakfast.
So how do you think that it can be made widely recognized that local municipalities absolutely need to be involved in broadband deployment? How can we drive that home? What methods can be deployed to do that?
That's a great question, TJ. Thank you. I think the Infrastructure Act paves the way by requiring states to write this 5-year broadband plan in conjunction with localities and regional entities. So if states are following the letter of the law, then by definition, they have to include municipalities in these conversations, and hopefully not just municipalities, but counties. I'm doing a lot of work right now with counties in Virginia, and counties play an absolutely underappreciated role in broadband planning, policy, and deployment. And heretofore, counties have I think not had a seat at the table in a number of states. I would love to see that change. So hopefully we're going to see counties and municipalities at the table when states start to create their 5-year broadband plans to access NTIA money. Again, though, going back to what we were talking about, TJ, at the beginning of this conversation, I am concerned with those states like, for instance, Illinois, who are contemplating legislation that would prohibit municipalities from accessing this money, which is in direct violation of the NTIA rules that we know of. So there's going to be some really interesting political fights about the future of municipalities in broadband planning.
Okay, Dave Tat again has a question. How do we get better routers into the hands of those that cannot upgrade their internet for any variety of reasons as an outgrowth of these fundings that we've spoken about?
Goodness, great question. And I think it really drives home the fact that, high-speed broadband in the ground or in the air is useless unless you've got the technologies and the skill sets and the training to be able to take advantage of it, right? And that means not only hardware like computers, but of course it means high quality routers as well. I, to be honest, am not sure what the best mechanism is for that. Goodness, maybe part of what it is there an opportunity for us to subsidize high quality routers through some of the affordable connectivity program, but you're absolutely right, David, that we need to think much more holistically around connectivity, that it's not just the internet connection and not just the computer or the tablet or the phone at the end of the day, but it is a much more holistic ecosystem, and routers play an absolutely crucial role in this. And the other thing is we need to make sure that we're holding ISPs accountable to the quality of their technology, right? So when you're renting a router from Comcast or from Verizon or from Charter, you should be confident that that is the best piece of technology. And I'm not sure consumers are. I mean, my husband and I have replaced our router multiple times because it has failed on us. And that shouldn't be happening. So we also need to, as much as we can think about, passing some congressional money onto the subsidization of routers, we absolutely need to be holding ISPs accountable to the quality of their technology.
Okay, question from Jace Wilson of Broadband.money. He says, it is clear you have some remarkable ideas about broadband policy and society. How did you get so passionate about the broadband space in the first place?
Oh, Jace, goodness, that's an excellent question. Thank you. I think I have my passion in my scholarship since I began grad school has always been around local communication. I've written a lot on local television. I've written a lot on local newspapers. And so my commitment to broadband comes out of both my academic interest and my deep passion for local communities and local communication. And this is where we're seeing today that impasse. Local communities cannot communicate in so many ways that so many of us take for granted because of these connectivity issues. My colleague, Nicholas Matthews at the University of Minnesota, and I did a study in a county in Virginia that is the least connected county in Virginia, but also a county that is a news desert, that there is no local news and information. And one thing we were really curious about is how do folks get news and information? What are their concerns? And we learned so much around the kind of do-it-yourself ethos in communities that are un and underconnected. We need to make it easier for them. We need to make it easier for these local communities to communicate within their communities and the outside world. And that to me means broadband. So I'm going to do whatever I can in my research, in my writing, in my public work to make sure that local communities can be connected and have the right to communicate, which is something we all take for granted.
Okay, Mike Falloon of Broadband.money has a loaded question asking, do you think there is a day we'll no longer talk about the digital divide?
Oh, goodness. I hate to say this. I don't think there's going to be a day where we're going to not talk about the digital divide. And here's why. The history of technology is always going to start deployment with urban and wealthy areas. That's how it's going to happen. So we're always going to see some form of a divide when we talk about the diffusion of technology. That being said, we can absolutely mitigate this part of the digital divide. We can absolutely stop talking about infrastructure divide. There is an end point. I don't think we'll ever, stop talking about the fact that rural rural providers are always going to need, for instance, to be subsidized because of this market failure, unless we, dramatically bring down the cost of broadband deployment. But there's always going to be the haves and have-nots, and we're always going to have to be sensitive to and underconnected communities. And what that's going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years, I'm not sure what and interconnectivity will look like, but it's going to happen. We're always going to need to make sure that students have access to the best technology. We're always going to have to make sure that our elderly communities are connected. We're always going to have to make sure that remote areas have the same type of connectivity. So I think we're always going to have to be vigilant about this and not being complacent that just because we threw in $65 billion that now the digital divide is over and we're good to go. It's going to be beholden on us, I think, in this community, and this is a community that I love so very dearly, to make sure that when these divides pop up, that we are well equipped to be able to reconcile them.
Okay, getting towards the end of our hour
right.
here, but so as an academic, what fields do you think we need to be studying more to improve broadband deployment? Into what is more research needed?
That is a great question. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit selfishly first. I think we need more scholars, and I think we need more young, passionate scholars thinking about technology policy, thinking about communication policy. That's just very selfishly because this is the field I'm in, and I want to see a surge of early career scholars, of doctoral students, master's students, undergrad students passionate about these issues. Because one of the things we need to be doing is to democratize policy, right? Policy is not written for everyday people. Policy is written for, forgive me, but for lawyers, right? And for executives and congressional people. They're not written for boards of supervisors. So we need to make sure that we've got an academic community there and able to do that absolutely vital translation from policy to action. The other thing, and this is something I learned in the road trip, TJ, was we need to continue to put a human face on policy issues. So we need to make sure that as we've got policy scholars, that there's also those, or they can also be policy scholars who are spending time in rural, remote, tribal communities, unconnected, underconnected urban communities, minority communities, newcomer communities, all those traditionally disenfranchised communities, to learn their stories and amplify their stories and to work with them so that they can tell their own stories. This needs to be the role of scholars as well in our contribution to solving the many digital divides that exist in the United States and around the world.
One more important kind of caveat question. It's a large question probably though.
Okay.
How can the NTIA and states make latency, stability, those two factors as important, if not more important, so than throughput in the criteria that they put out?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, we've got 2 rounds of rulemaking right now, right? We've got the NTIA rulemaking that's going to come out on May 15th, and then we're going to have the states, individual states rulemaking in terms of how they're going to deploy this money. Latency can be added at any of these points. I mean, right now, we're going to continue to have this basic definition of broadband. But states, to the best of my knowledge, are going to be free to add different criteria. So maybe one thing we can start focusing on is, can states, when they are promoting the money available through NTIA, can they have a latency component to their eligibility criteria? I don't believe that would be a violation of technological neutrality or anything like that. But again, I'll go back to the exact same point. I think this brings us full circle from an hour ago of the importance of May 15th for the NTIA, so we can start thinking about the changes we need to see at the state level after NTIA has these rulemaking.
Good way to end. All right, that is our session, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. And please tune in to our next Ask Me Anything session at Broadband.